two questions, and one of those which I was also thinking. One is, when you look at the project, like, as you mentioned that there hasn't been any project on measuring GPI in India and like South Asian countries in those areas. One question would be, what is the time frame, because you would be an expert to look at it, to be able to fathom the time frame, how long does it take to measure GPI for a few countries like India and subcontinent? And secondly, in terms of receiving data on like infrastructure and benefits, the social benefits. So how are the data collected?
So, well, I mentioned that I'll use World Bank data. So there's quite a lot of. I need to use a consistent database.
Right.
Because if I don't use a consistent database, it means you can't really make genuine comparisons between countries. So I've got the data set. It's not a perfect data set, but it's a very good one. It's a World Bank data set, and as I mentioned in my presentation, it's a highly respected data set. How long would it take to calculate the GPI for the 8 South Asian countries? It could take 2 or 3 months. Now, the time period over which I'd calculate would be the same as it is here for Saudi Arabia. So the data only goes to 2016 at present. I mean, there are some data for some items that go to 2017, but the fact that I don't have it to 2016 means I have to go as far as I got data for each to calculate each item. So it'd be 1970 through to 2016. So that's a 46-year period. So it's a long time. That's right. Yes?
How do you include Human Development Index in this calculation as well? Do you include human development or human capital?
Well, this in fact is a measure of human development, in a sense. By having all these items, because human development, if you think about it,
not even human capital, formation.
Okay, that's a good point.
Yeah.
There isn't an item for human-made capital or human capital because the benefits of human capital is that you're a more productive society. You use resources more efficiently.
Yeah.
And that's reflected in the items that make up the GPI. If you're a more productive society, your consumption benefits are higher. Generally, if you've got high human capital, there's at least the potential to have a more even distribution of income, which would further increase consumption benefits. If you're a more productive and more efficient producer of goods and services, then that should reduce your environmental costs. So that'll be reflected in lower environmental costs. So you've got to be careful when you calculate the GPI, that you don't double count. Right? The benefits of human-made or human capital are reflected in the items that make up the GPI. To have a separate item for human capital would mean you'd be double counting. So the benefits of strong human capital, good, high-quality human capital, well-educated human beings, is reflected in the other GPI items. So it's reflected indirectly. So human capital, we build up human capital because of the various benefits that are generated, are reflected in the benefit items, and hopefully to minimise the costs.
That may also be the reason for the Saudi Arabia's GPI, quite lower than GDP.
Very, very much so, because of its very, very strong, heavy reliance upon oil, which is a non-renewable resource, which is a cost item. Okay. Now, as much as a cost item, you can invest some of the proceeds from mining or oil to build up productive capacity, to build up other areas of the economy. Clearly, given the fact that the per capita GPI of Saudi Arabia is so much lower than its per capita GDP, they're not obviously doing that at a sufficient rate or in sufficient quantities. If they were, then the per capita GPI would be much closer to the per capita GDP. Right, so that's an indication that it's, in a sense, squandering the oil revenues. It's basically consuming them. It's using them for consumption purposes and not sufficiently to invest in alternative forms of capital. Darren.
Yeah, so what are your bottom line measures? Most people think in terms of dollars, but the GPI, all those items you listed as...
They're all converted into dollar values.
They're all converted?
Yeah.
Most of those items don't have dollar values to them.
No, well, for example, an environmental cost item, you do the physical change, okay, and then you assign, so if it's wastewater pollution, this wouldn't be the case, but just to simplify things, you might say for every megalitre of industrial wastewater pollution, the cost is $10, the environmental cost.
An estimate.
You have to make estimates and so forth. So you definitely do the physical change, the physical impact on the natural environment first, to get some idea of the impact, and then you multiply that by some dollar value to obtain the total impact on the environment in a monetary sense. You have to do it in order to be able to add and subtract all the items, to aggregate the items.
That's we've got in our dollar economy, isn't it?
It is, although the problem with the way things are currently measured is that dollar valued costs, in the case of GDP, increase the GDP. At least they lower the GPI.
From India. From India, Ananya is asking for calculating this per capita GPI. What are the factors we consider constant and what are variable factors?
Well, all the physical changes, the consumption, the changes or the distribution of income are varied or are potentially variable. I mean, they are what they are, okay? We don't just say this is a constant. I mean, it's not much point in trying to calculate something to get an indication of how economic welfare, well-being of a country is changing over time if you're holding things constant. So everything is measured as it is for a particular year. If the benefits go up over time, well, of course they vary upwards, and if the costs go up, well then they get that is an increase in a negative value, and it's subtracted from the GPI. So nothing's held constant.
Okay.
Well, unless something stays constant.
And can you explain why South Australia is apparently a poorer sister of other Australian states? Why South Australia is better GPI than...
Well, I've mentioned it. Yeah, there were...
Can you repeat it a little bit more?
Well, I could just go through what I said if you want. South Australia has a more even distribution of income. Now, I mentioned the fact that, so even though there's greater per capita consumption in some of the eastern states, a lot of, in a relative sense, more of that goes to wealthier people than it does to poorer people in the eastern states or the other states of Australia compared to South Australia. Meaning that we're getting more welfare benefit from a given level of consumption in South Australia compared to the rest of Australia. South Australia has lower cost of living, lower environmental costs, significantly lower environmental costs, and they were due to a number of factors: more efficient use of water, almost a complete cessation of natural vegetation clearance, whilst that's still occurring in other states, low levels of energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. And as I also mentioned, South Australia relies less heavily upon depleting natural resources in order to generate the income that finances its consumption. It relies more heavily upon adding value through manufacturing, adding value to resources. So they're the main factors. Yeah, got another question over here.
Oh.
I can see that you have accounted deforestation as a cost for
Yes.
GPI. But what about ecosystem services you get from the...
Oh, okay. So the question is that the GPI includes deforestation, but does it therefore capture the loss of ecosystem services? That deforestation item...
Loss or gain? Because
also gain, yes. Yeah. The deforestation item is made up of two aspects. There's the timber aspect of forest and also the ecosystem services. Now, the reason why you need the two is because in some countries the so-called area of forest hasn't changed. But in a lot of cases, what's happened is that native vegetation has been replaced by plantations. So the timber that's available for use hasn't changed, but the ecosystem values of the forest has been diminished. If that's the case, that item goes up and that has a negative effect on the GPI. But of course it doesn't have a negative effect on GDP. In fact, if the natural forest wasn't being used, but of course is generating ecosystem services, that's not included in GDP, and if that's replaced by plantations, in fact the GDP goes up. If those plantations are then used to extract or harvest timber for production purposes, that will increase GDP, but it won't do the same for GPI, in fact could lower the GPI. So deforestation includes the timber element and also the ecosystem services element.
And Sobin and Imran Maqsood and Mahfouz asking, so Nepal and Bangladesh are also poor developing country. So do you think if we calculate we can expect that GPI is more than GDP because not much economic development or resource destruction sort of thing. So what do you think?
Okay, well, of course I don't know, and it's of trying to preempt what you are trying to calculate. Right, so I just calculate it as it is. But that's a very good point. What you find is one of the major items that's not included GDP, which is a benefit item rather than a cost item, I've mentioned, is the value of unpaid household labour and the shadow economy. They are large in every economy, whether they're poor or rich. And actually, in actual fact, the general view is that you have your formal economic activity and lying on top of it is your unpaid household labour and shadow economy. That's wrong. It's the other way around. The basis of all societies, of course, is the unpaid element, the informal element, and then it's the formal element that sits on top. So what I find is that, for example, you hear that people, or a certain percentage of people in a poor country are living on $1 a day. No, they're not. What that indicates is that of the goods and services they're purchasing from the formal economy, they're buying equivalent to $1 worth of goods and services each day. But they're also gaining the benefits of unpaid household labour and the shadow economy, which is not picked up in the GDP. So in actual fact, for very poor countries, their per capita GPI is quite often higher than the per capita GDP. The concern is, for those particular countries, is that the GPI tends to start off above the GDP, but as it starts to so-called develop, its per capita GPI doesn't go up very much, its per capita GDP does, and in fact it overtakes it, giving the impression, the rise in per capita GDP, that it's experiencing a rapid rate of genuine progress when the per capita GPI is not indicating that at all.
There's one more question from India. There is one more question from India, Ananda. If possible, to explain how we can implement this GPI to monitor regional and national study in steps.
So is that referring to policy or?
Yeah, it's basically how they're going to. Okay, there will be lots of data. So how we will implement in our real life?
Well, that depends on what the policymakers do with the data. But the data so you use data, but you generate new data. That's the important thing about the genuine progress indicator. You use data, but you in fact generate new data, very important data, which can be used by policymakers. Now, whether they use that in an appropriate way, I'm not a policymaker. Although you can suggest policies from the data that policymakers perhaps should undertake to improve the well-being of people in a particular country. But it generates data that you don't get from the GDP. It creates new data, provides new information that enables policymakers to design policies that can genuinely increase the well-being of people within a country that you don't get with GDP. In fact, GDP on the other hand, there can be a danger. If GDP is going up and you assume that rising GDP means rising well-being, then you may design policies that boost the GDP that, if you don't have a GPI, might be lowering the GPI, maybe in fact reducing economic welfare in a nation.
The question is a bit vague. You did mention about global financial crisis, and my understanding is normally when it's a shadow economy actually works as a buffer when there is a global financial crisis or any kind of a crisis. So will having a genuine progress indicator will act as will that be detrimental when there is a global financial crisis, or is it going to be working in favor in developing the
well, generally the informal economy, unpaid household labour, that's fairly steady over time. It all depends on population, of course. If you've got more people, then you've got more, in total, you'll have more unpaid household labour, but on a per capita basis, that tends to stay relatively constant. Okay, and as you are saying, that's because it does serve as a buffer. The interesting thing about a financial crisis is that it tends to have a significant downward effect on GDP, but not so much on the GPI. Okay, because of the buffer and the fact that there are other elements within the GPI. For example, you do have less economic activity when you have something like a global financial crisis, but that means you have fewer environmental costs. Whereas it all looks bad from a GDP point of view. I'm not saying it looks good from a GPI point of view when you have a financial... You want to avoid a financial crisis if you can. Okay? But the GPI will just give you a better indication of what the effect on people's well-being is of a financial crisis compared to GDP. Did that answer your question?
Yep.
A few more questions. How GPI going to help different with GDP? Very fundamental, but people don't know. There's lots of questions. And what are the advantage of GPI than over GDP?
Okay, well, I've sort of gone through that, really.
Yeah.
The advantage is, firstly, it's a better means of calculating the well-being of a nation because it counts the benefits, treats them as a positive item, counts the costs, and subtracts the costs from the benefits. You get a much more accurate measure of the well-being of a nation. Whereas GDP, even a cost which boosts GDP, will appear as a benefit when in fact it should be subtracted. Okay, so apart from anything else, just comparing the GPI and the GDP, you will get a better indication of the genuine progress of a nation. But even more importantly, because the GPI is made up of so many different benefit and cost items of the economic, social and environmental kind, it means that it provides much richer information that you can, or enables you to see the relationship between the values of these items and the GPI. Okay, you can see why the GPI rises. Now, the GPI can rise for two reasons, I guess, in a sense. It can rise because the benefit's gone up, or it can rise because the cost has gone down. Okay? So it makes it easier to identify those factors that are affecting the well-being of a nation's people, which then allows you to design policies that can increase economic welfare. It also makes it easier if you before you implement a policy, you may want to simulate the change or the effect of that policy before you introduce it. You are going to have a much better indication of what the overall effect will be on people's well-being using a GPI compared to a GDP. So you might have a policy that you want to introduce. You might simulate the fact that GDP might rise. But if it leads to a fall in the GPI, that would be a policy that would not be worthwhile introducing.
Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? But I still want to know that in a typical developing country and a developed country, how the GPI will look like.
Well,
the graph will, how a layman in the road who doesn't know anything on economics, is not an academic,
Well, you don't-
how they will understand the graph, how they will read the graph.
Well,
In a developing country, how the GPI and GDP
Okay.
will look like and how they will read.
Well,
the
of
graph.
course, as I said, it's difficult to know what it will look like because it looks different for every country.
Okay, so
Uh,
there is
but-
no
but-
perfect GPI curve for a developed country or developing
No, no,
country?
no. No, so, well, for example, you can see there, in fact, I've also done Qatar, another oil producing country, and with Qatar, it's got the highest per capita GDP in the world. It's about 119,000 international dollars. Its per capita GPI is only about $30,000. So it's even, compared to Saudi Arabia, even smaller in relative sense to its per capita GDP. Now, you don't know that. In fact, that's the purpose of calculating the GPI, to find out what the effect is on the well-being of the people. But for anyone, I don't think you really need to know any economics to know that if that red line is one indicator and the blue line is another, okay, and the blue line is a better indicator of well-being, genuine progress, then you're not doing as well as the red line indicates. You don't have to know anything about economics to see that.